Welcome to Divine Peace. Tonight we'll read through the Book of Nahum to help you slow down, settle your thoughts, and drift into peaceful sleep. There will be no ads while you listen. If this channel brings you rest, consider subscribing, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. There was once a city that heard the voice of God and lived. Picture it in the last light of a summer evening, more than 2,500 years ago. The sun sinks low over the plain, and the Tigris River runs slow and silver along the eastern edge of a great walled city. The water carries the smell of mud and reeds. Fishing boats knock gently against the banks, and rising above the river, catching the last gold of the day, stand the walls of Nineveh, walls so vast that a person could walk their length for hours and not come to the end. This is the capital of the greatest empire the ancient world had yet seen. This is Nineveh at its height. The city sprawls along the riverbank, its walls stretching somewhere between 7 and 12 kilometers around. A circuit so wide that within it lie not only houses and markets and temples, but gardens and orchards and open ground. The walls are punctuated by monumental gates, each one a work of engineering, each one a statement of power. Guards stand along the ramparts. Below them, the streets fill with the ordinary sounds of a city settling toward night, the last calls of merchants, the bleating of animals, the creak of cartwheels on stone, the distant murmur of 100,000 lives folded together in one place. For here live perhaps 120,000 people. A figure remembered in the pages of an old and famous book, a city so great that same book once said it took 3 days to cross, and at the heart of it all stands the palace, the southwest palace of Sennacherib, a structure so grand that the king who built it called it a palace without rival. Its walls are lined with panels of carved stone, bas-reliefs cut with astonishing detail, telling in silent pictures the story of Assyria's conquests. Winged bulls with human faces guard the great doorways, their beards curled, their eyes fixed forever on the horizon. Water flows through the city along aqueducts, an engineering marvel drawing life from the hills to feed the gardens of a king. There are temples, there are parks, there is wealth beyond counting gathered from every corner of a conquered world. This is the city. And this is where our story begins, not with its glory, but with a memory of one strange and startling day, roughly a century before. Because Nineveh, this cruel and dazzling place, was once a city that repented. The story is one of the most remarkable in all the ancient world. A prophet had come, a reluctant man named Jonah, who had tried to run from the task laid on him, who had gone to sea to flee it, and who had been brought back by ways the old book tells in wonder to the very place he had tried to escape. And when at last he came to Nineveh, he walked into the city and spoke a message of doom. The city, he said, was to be overthrown. And something happened that almost never happens. The city listened. The people of Nineveh, from the greatest to the least, believed the word. They put on sackcloth, the rough, coarse cloth of grief and repentance. They fasted. And the message rose all the way to the throne. The king himself, we're told, rose from his seat, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. He sent out a decree that every person, and even every animal, should fast and cry out. Let everyone turn from their evil ways, the king commanded, and from the violence in their hands, and God saw it. God saw that they turned from their evil ways, and he relented. The destruction that had been announced did not come. Hold that moment in your mind for a little while, because it is the foundation on which everything that follows will rest. A whole city, standing on the edge of ruin, was given a reprieve. The sentence was lifted. The doom was called back. Nineveh, the capital of a power that would come to be feared across the whole earth, was shown a mercy so wide that it must have seemed to anyone who saw it like a new beginning. Nineveh was given time. That is the heart of it. Not merely spared for a day, but given years, given a whole century, given the long, quiet gift of more time than most cities of the ancient world could ever hope for. The clock that had been running down was, in that moment of mercy, wound up again and set going anew. And the question that will shape all the rest of this reading, the question that hangs over the city like the smoke of its own hearth fires, is a simple one. What did Nineveh do with that time? This is the strange and heavy irony we carry with us into the pages of an old prophecy. For 100 years after Jonah walked its streets and the king sat in the dust, the memory of that mercy remained. And yet the city that had once tasted mercy did not hold on to it. As one writer has put it, the city that once tasted mercy eventually spat it out to gulp down rebellion. The record of what came after is written in stone, and it is not gentle. For after Jonah, Nineveh did not remain the humbled city sitting in ashes. It grew, it hardened. It became something far greater and far darker than it had been before. Under its kings, and above all under the great king Sennacherib, who ruled in the years around 700 to 681 before our era, the city rose to a splendour and a cruelty that made its name a byword across the ancient Near East. Sennacherib was the builder of that palace without rival. He was the one who ringed the city with its mighty walls, who brought water down from the hills, who filled his halls with the carved stone panels that still, thousands of years later, tell the story of his reign. He gathered artisans and engineers and set them to work making Nineveh the wonder of the world. And he gathered armies and set them to work making the world afraid. His campaigns are the campaigns of a man who understood terror as an instrument of power. And of all his campaigns, one has come down to us with a vividness that few events of the ancient world can match, because Sennacherib himself chose to have it carved, panel by panel, into the walls of his own palace, so that all who walked through his halls would see it. The siege of Lachish. Lachish was a fortress of Judah, a strong-walled town to the southwest, and in the year 701 before our era, Sennacherib brought the full weight of the Assyrian war machine against it. What happened there was recorded not only in the memory of the people who suffered it, but in the stone reliefs that once lined the king's palace at Nineveh, the Lachish reliefs, as they are known. Look at those carvings, and you look into the face of Assyrian warfare. You see the siege ramp built against the walls. You see the great engines rolled up against the fortifications. You see the archers rank on rank, and the defenders on the walls, and you see what became of the conquered. The reliefs show captives being led away in long lines. They show the iron hooks used to lead prisoners. They show, without flinching and without mercy, the fate of those who resisted, the impaling of the defenders, the flaying of the fallen. This was not violence hidden away in shame. This was violence displayed, celebrated, carved into the walls of the king's own house so that every visitor would understand exactly what the empire could do. And Lachish was only one town. Sennacherib's own annals, the official records his scribes kept of his deeds, boast of 46 of Hezekiah's fortified cities taken in that single campaign against Judah. 46. And of the king of Judah himself, Hezekiah, shut up in his capital, Jerusalem, the annals say he was trapped like a caged bird. Here the records diverge, and it is worth pausing over the difference. On the fate of Jerusalem, the Assyrian account and the account preserved in the Bible do not agree. The Assyrian annals claim that Hezekiah, shut in his city, was made to pay a heavy tribute, gold and silver and treasure carried off to Nineveh. The Bible tells of a deliverance, a night in which the siege was broken, and the great army turned back from the walls of Jerusalem without taking it. Two accounts, two memories of the same season of terror, and where they part we do not press beyond what each one says. What both agree upon is the devastation of the land, the fall of city after city, the breaking of a whole country beneath the Assyrian advance. And behind the sieges lay something even more systematic than the sieges themselves. For the Assyrians had made an art of a particular kind of cruelty, the policy of mass deportation. When they conquered a people, they did not simply defeat them and leave them in their land. They uprooted them. They tore whole populations from their homes and carried them away, scattering them across the empire, breaking up nations and communities and families, so that no conquered people could ever again gather the strength to rebel. It was policy. It was strategy. It was done coldly and on a scale that is hard to grasp. The estimates run to hundreds of thousands of people, forcibly relocated over the years of the empire's power. Whole nations emptied into exile, marched along the roads under guard, resettled far from everything they had known, made to serve the needs of the empire in fields and workshops and building projects. And Sennacherib carried out this policy with a ruthless efficiency that made it one of the defining marks of his reign. His annals return again and again to a single image, a boast that his scribes seemed to love. His enemies, he said, were swept away like a flood. It is a striking phrase, this flood. A wall of water rolling over the land, carrying away everything in its path, leaving nothing behind. And Sennacherib did not use the image only as a metaphor. When the great city of Babylon rose against him, he destroyed it. And then, according to the record, he turned the waters against it, flooding the ruined city, making the metaphor real, drowning what remained of a place that had dared to defy him. This is what Nineveh became. This is the city that grew up in the century after the sackcloth and the ashes, a centre of imperial violence unchecked, a power that ruled by terror and celebrated its terror in stone, a city grown fat on the tribute of broken nations and the labour of the deported, the cruelest imperial power the ancient Near East had yet known. Nineveh had tasted mercy once and had not kept it. It had been given time, and had used that time to become the thing that Jonah's warning had first been sent to turn it from. The violence in their hands, which the repentant king had once commanded them to lay aside, had returned tenfold, and now flowed out across the whole world. And so the stage is set, a city at the height of its power, glittering and terrible, its walls unbroken, its palace without rival, its armies feared to the ends of the earth, a city that seemed, to anyone who looked upon it, utterly beyond reach, too great to fall, too strong to be shaken, too proud ever to hear a word of judgment again. Into that certainty, a word comes. It comes not from a king, nor from a general, nor from any figure of power. It comes from a man about whom we know almost nothing at all. His name is Nahum. That is nearly the whole of what we can say of him with any confidence. His name, and one word to place him, Nahum of Elkosh. So the book that bears his name begins, and beyond that single line of identification, the prophet vanishes into a silence so complete that scholars have argued for centuries over even the most basic facts of his life. Take his hometown, Elkosh. It ought to be a simple thing to know where a man came from. But Elkosh cannot be located with any certainty at all. It has been placed in many corners of the world by those who have tried to find it. Some have looked to Galilee in the north and pointed to a village whose very name, Capernaum, has been read to mean the village of Nahum, as though the prophet's memory clung to the stones of a small town by a lake. Others have looked to Judah in the south to sites near Jerusalem, and still others have looked far to the east, to a place called Elkosh in the land of Assyria itself, in what is now Iraq, as if the prophet who spoke against Nineveh might himself have lived in its shadow. The truth is that we do not know. The place has slipped out of the reach of certainty, and the man with it. We do not know when exactly he lived, save within a window we can draw from the words of his book. We know that he speaks of the fall of a great Egyptian city, Thebes, called Noamon in the Old Text, as an event already past, a thing that had happened and become a memory to be reflected upon. That fall came in the year 663 before our era, and we know that Nineveh itself, the city against which Nahum's whole prophecy is aimed, fell in the year 612. So somewhere in that span of years, after Thebes had fallen and before Nineveh met its end, Nahum spoke. A window of about half a century, in which a single voice rose to declare the end of the world's great city. But of the man himself, his family, his age, his trade, the shape of his days, the sound of his voice, nothing. He appears in his own book only to name himself, and then he steps aside, and the words go on without him. And this silence, this near total absence of the man, is not a loss to be mourned. It is, in its own quiet way, part of the meaning of the thing. For the Book of Nahum is not the story of Nahum. It never once turns to tell us of the prophet's struggles, or his fears, or his reluctance, or his journey. There is nothing here like the story of Jonah. No runaway prophet, no great fish, no dialogue between a man and his God on the edge of a doomed city. Jonah's book is a narrative, and its centre is a man wrestling with a mercy he does not want to see given. Nahum's book is nothing of the kind. Nahum is a poem. That is the form of what lies ahead, and it is worth settling into before the words begin. What we are about to read is not a chronicle, not a history laid out in the plain telling of events. It is a sustained and intense piece of Hebrew poetry. By many accounts, one of the most powerful and unrelenting poems of judgment in the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. It moves not by narration, but by image, by rhythm, by the beat and pulse of language shaped for the ear. It is called, in the language of the prophets, a massa, a burden, an oracle, a weight laid upon a city, a word that must be carried and delivered, whatever the cost. And because it is a poem, it works differently than a story does. It does not hurry to tell us what happened next. It lingers. It gathers force slowly, like a storm building on the horizon before the first roll of thunder. It piles image upon image. It circles back. It moves with the deliberate heavy cadence, rising and falling, and the listener is meant not to race through it, but to feel its weight settle line by line. It begins in the heights, with the majesty of God's justice, with the picture of a God who is slow to anger but great in power, a God who will not leave the guilty unpunished. And from those heights it descends, step by step, toward the collapse of the city that once held the whole world in fear. It is a poem that moves from thunder to ruin, from the storm on the mountains to the empty and silent streets of a fallen capital. And here the anonymity of the prophet becomes a kind of gift. Because Nahum steps aside so completely, because he gives us his name and then disappears, there is nothing standing between the listener and the word itself. There is no personality to attach to, no life story to distract, no character whose fate we follow. The man dissolves, and what remains is the message. The weight falls where it is meant to fall, not on the prophet, but on the city, and on the God who speaks against it, and on all who have ears to hear. This is what makes the book what it is. The prophet no one remembers, speaking a word that has never been forgotten. A man lost to history, whose lines have outlasted the empire he spoke against by more than 2,500 years. Nineveh's walls are ruins now, its palace a field of broken stone dug from the earth. But the poem stands. The words go on. The burden is still carried, still delivered, still read aloud in the quiet, as it will be read tonight. So let us settle in for it. Let us let the city rise once more in the mind's eye. The walls along the Tigris, the gates, the palace without rival, the 120,000 souls, the memory of sackcloth long since cast aside, the violence gathered again into ready hands. Let us hold the whole strange irony of it together. A city given mercy, a city given time, a city that took its reprieve and turned it into an empire of terror. And into that world, a single voice, rising from a town no one can find, spoken by a man no one remembers, gathering the storm. There is a rhythm coming, a slow, heavy, rolling rhythm, the kind of rhythm that does not startle but settles, that moves like distant thunder over the hills, felt as much as heard, rising and falling with a weight that asks nothing of you but that you listen. Let the day's cares loosen their grip. Let the walls of the ancient city stand quiet in your imagination, lit by the last gold of a sun that set on them 100 generations ago. Let your breathing slow to match the cadence of the lines. There is nothing to hurry toward now, and nothing to fear. The story is finished. The city has long since fallen. What remains is only the poem, and the poem asks only that you rest within it. For the God of whom Nahum will speak is a God described in the first breath of the book as slow to anger, patient beyond the measure of any earthly patience, giving mercy freely, giving time abundantly, waiting long and long before the word of judgment falls. That same slowness that gave Nineveh its 100 years, that same patience that let a city that should have fallen rise instead to its height. There is a comfort folded into that slowness, though we are only at the very edge of it now, only at the opening, only beginning to feel the first low notes of the thunder gathering over the hills. And there is, tucked within this poem of judgment, a shelter as well, a quiet word of refuge for those who trust, a still centre in the midst of the storm. But that comes later, that comes as the poem unfolds. For now we stand at the beginning, at the naming of the prophet and the city, at the moment before the first line of the oracle is spoken. The evening deepens, the river runs on beneath the walls. The lamps are lit in the great palace, and the guards keep their watch along the ramparts, unaware that a word has already gone out against them, carried by a man whose name they will never learn. The city sleeps in its strength, certain of its walls, certain of its armies, certain that no power on earth could ever bring it low. And in a place we cannot find, a prophet takes up his burden and begins to speak. Let the words come slowly now. Let them settle line by line, with a breath between each one, the way the old poem was always meant to be heard, not rushed, not pressed, but given room to rise and fall like the slow swell of the sea, or the long roll of thunder over distant hills, or the quiet, steady breathing of one who is finally, after a long day, beginning to rest. The burden is ready to be carried, the oracle is ready to be spoken, and you have nothing to do but listen and let go, and drift towards sleep as the ancient words begin their slow and steady work in the quiet of the night. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. Let that first line settle before we move to the second. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. Hear how it begins, not with the city, not with the empire, not with the crimes gathered up over a century of cruelty. It begins with God. The whole weight of the poem starts here, in the naming of who God is, before a single word is spoken about who Nineveh has become. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. Notice the slow accumulation of the words: jealous, avenging, taking vengeance, filled with wrath. 4 movements, one after another, each one adding to the last, none of them hurried. The poem does not race to its point. It gathers, it layers. It sets down one heavy word, and then another, the way stones are set into a foundation, deliberately, one at a time, each pressing down upon the one before it. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes, and he maintains his wrath against his enemies. There is a patience in the very structure of these lines. They do not shout, they repeat, and in the repeating they build something that cannot be shaken. This is a poem that was written with great care. The opening verses are shaped as an acrostic, a poem in which the lines begin, in order, with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It is a form built for order, for completeness, for the sense that nothing has been left out, that the whole of the matter has been laid down from beginning to end, and the beginning of that ordered whole is not destruction, it is character. Who is this God? That is the first question the poem answers, before it will answer any other, not what will happen to Nineveh, not when the walls will fall, but who stands behind the falling. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The word jealous here is not the small and bitter thing we so often mean by it. It is not the anxiety of a man who fears he is losing what he loves. It is the deep and rightful claim of one who has bound himself to a people, and will not see them destroyed without answer. It is the jealousy of a covenant, not the jealousy of a wound, and so the vengeance that follows is not the flailing of the powerless, it is the settled response of the one who has the right and the power to set things right. Listen now to how the poem turns from the naming of God to the movement of God through the world. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. There it is again, that word, that quality we touched at the very edge of the previous night. Slow to anger. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished, but he is slow to anger. He is patient. He waits. And here the poem opens up something worth resting in for a long, quiet while. For we tend to think of slowness as weakness. We tend to think that the one who is quick to strike is the one who is strong, and the one who waits is the one who is uncertain, or timid, or afraid. But the poem tells us the opposite, slow to anger, but great in power. The two are held together in a single breath. The slowness and the power are not opposites, they are companions. Consider how human anger works. Human anger is quick, it flares, it flashes, it rises before we have even understood what has happened, and it fades almost as fast, leaving us tired and ashamed. And why is human anger so quick? Often it is quick precisely because it is weak. We snap because we feel small. We lash out because we feel that if we do not strike now, in this instant, the moment will pass and our chance will be gone. Our anger is the anger of those who have little control over the world, over others, over ourselves. We cannot afford to be patient because patience feels like surrender. But the one who is truly great in power has no such fear. The one who holds all things does not need to hurry. He can afford to wait 100 years. He can afford to give a city its reprieve, and then give it more time still, and watch as that time is squandered, and wait yet longer. Not because he is uncertain, not because he is unwilling, but because his power is so complete that the moment is never lost. The chance never passes. The word once spoken will not fail to arrive, whether it arrives today or a century from today. This is the slowness of the one who cannot be outrun. And so the century that lay between Jonah's visit and Nahum's oracle takes on a new shape when we look at it through these lines. We remember that Jonah walked into that city and cried his warning, and the city against all expectation turned. The king rose from his throne and sat in the dust. The people put on sackcloth, and God relented, and the destruction did not come. That was mercy given. But it was more than mercy. It was time. A whole century of time. Time in which the city could have remembered. Time in which the sackcloth might have become a habit of the heart, rather than a garment cast off when the fear had passed. Time in which the empire, having tasted mercy, might have chosen to become something other than an engine of terror. The slowness of God gave Nineveh all of that, and Nineveh took the slowness for permission. It mistook the patience for absence. It looked at the long silence of heaven and concluded that heaven was not watching, or did not care, or could not act. This is the great danger folded inside the slowness of God. For the slowness that is meant as mercy can be received as license. The delay that is meant to give room for return can be read as proof that no reckoning is coming. And the poem is careful to close that misreading before it can take root. The Lord is slow to anger, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished. The slowness is not cancellation, it is delay. The judgment that was postponed was not forgotten. It was only waiting. Waiting with the same patience that gave the mercy, held in the same steady hand. And so when the judgment finally comes, it will not come as an impulse, or a fit of temper, or a sudden change of mind. It will come as the eventual movement of something that had been entirely still for a very long time. Think of the sea when it is calm. Think of the vast level surface of it, stretching out flat and quiet to the horizon, holding within itself a weight beyond all measuring. The stillness of the sea is not the stillness of emptiness, it is the stillness of enormous power at rest. And when that power begins, at last, to move, when the swell rises and the water gathers itself and rolls toward the shore, it does not move quickly, it moves slowly, ponderously, unstoppably, with all the weight of the deep behind it. That is the anger of the one who is slow to anger and great in power, not a flash, a tide. Now the poem gathers its full force, and the imagery turns from the character of God to the presence of God moving through creation itself. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet. Hear the scale of that. The whirlwind and the storm, the wildest, most uncontrollable forces the ancient world knew, the powers before which every human being stood helpless. These are not adversaries to be overcome. They are the road he walks upon. His way is in the whirlwind, and the clouds, the great towering thunderheads that darken the sky and blot out the sun, that seem to fill the whole heavens with their bulk. The clouds are the dust of his feet. The dust. The small thing kicked up by a footstep on a road. What is a mountain of cloud to us is a smudge of dust to him, raised as he passes. The poem stretches our sense of proportion until it nearly breaks. The largest things we know become the smallest things at the edge of his presence. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. The sea, that ancient image of chaos, of the untamed deep, of everything that lies beyond human control. He has only to rebuke it, and it withdraws. He makes the rivers run dry. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the blossoms of Lebanon fade. Bashan with its rich pastures, Carmel with its fruitful slopes, Lebanon famed across the ancient world for its cedars, its greenness, its abundance. The most fertile and living places the people knew, and they wither at his coming. They fade like flowers cut and left in the sun. This is what the scholars call theophany, a manifestation of God in the language of nature, mountains and seas and storms pressed into service to say what plain speech cannot. And it is worth pausing to understand what the poem is doing here, in this borrowing of the storm. Throughout the ancient Near East, the peoples around Israel told stories of storm gods, deities of thunder and rain and tempest, who rode the clouds and hurled the lightning and did battle with the sea. The imagery of the storm was familiar. It was the common language of power in that world. And Nahum takes up that language, the whirlwind, the storm, the clouds, the drying of the sea, and turns it entirely. For in this poem there is no battle between the storm god and the sea, no struggle of equals, no uncertain outcome. There is only the Lord and the whole storming, seething world beneath his feet like dust on a road. He does not fight the chaos, he rebukes it, and it obeys. He does not wrestle the sea, he speaks, and it dries up. The poem takes the mightiest images its world could offer and uses them to show that even those mightiest things are small. This is not merely a political oracle now. This is a statement about the nature of reality itself. The mountains quake before him, and the hills melt away. The earth trembles at his presence, the world and all who live in it. The mountains, the oldest, most permanent things in the landscape, the things that were there before any human memory and would be thereafter. Even the mountains quake. The hills melt away like wax before a flame. The earth itself trembles. And here the poem asks its great, quiet question. Who can withstand his indignation? Who can endure his fierce anger? The question hangs in the air and it answers itself by its very asking. No one, nothing. Not the sea, not the mountains, not the great empires, not the walls that seem so strong, not the armies that have never been defeated. His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are shattered before him. The rocks, shattered. The most solid, enduring thing, broken open like a clay pot. If the rocks cannot stand, what chance has a city, however great, however walled, however certain of itself? This is the cosmological prologue. Before the poem names a single crime of Nineveh, before it describes a single siege engine or a single fallen wall, it has established the frame within which everything else will be understood. The destruction of Nineveh will not be a random turning of the wheel of history. It will not be an accident of politics, one empire simply giving way to the next as empires always do. It will be the inevitable consequence of the nature of reality itself, the working out, in the affairs of men and cities, of who God is and how the world is made. The poem grounds us in the permanence of God's character before it says one word about the city's fate. And now, in the very midst of all this, in the middle of the withering and the trembling and the shattering, the poem does something unexpected. It stops. It grows quiet. It opens up a clearing in the storm. The Lord is good. Let that land in the silence after all that has come before. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. Here, in a single verse, tucked between the shattered rocks and the fire of his wrath, is the pastoral heart of the entire book. It is easy to miss. It is surrounded on every side by images of destruction, and the eye tends to slide over it, hurrying on to the next scene of ruin. But this verse is why the poem was written, not to describe destruction for its own sake, not to gloat over a fallen enemy, but to say to a frightened and long-suffering people, the Lord is good, the Lord is a refuge. Remember whose voice this is. Remember the name of the prophet who speaks it. Nahum. The name means comfort, consolation. And here, at last, we understand why a book so full of ruin should be carried by a man whose very name means comfort. For the comfort and the ruin are the same thing, seen from two different sides. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. But what were the times of trouble? They were not abstract, they were not a figure of speech. For the people who first heard these words, the times of trouble had faces and dates and names. Think of who those are, the ones who take refuge in him. Think first of the northern kingdom of Israel. For it was Assyria that came against Samaria, and it was Assyria that broke it, and it was into the cities of the Assyrian Empire that the people of the north were carried away, deported, scattered, uprooted from the land of their fathers, and marched off along the roads to distant provinces, never to return as a people again. Those were the times of trouble, whole villages emptied, whole families broken and dispersed, a kingdom erased from the map, its people vanishing into the vast machinery of the empire. And think of Judah. Think of the day the armies of Assyria came down like a flood upon the fortified cities of the south. 46 of Judah's walled cities were taken. 46. Each one a place where people had been born and had lived and had thought themselves safe behind their walls. Each one broken open. Think of the people who stood on the walls of Jerusalem and watched the Assyrian army encamp outside. The tents spread across the hills, the banners, the siege works being raised, the sheer, overwhelming mass of the force that had never been turned back, that had swallowed nation after nation, that now sat down before their own gates. Those were the times of trouble, and into that memory, into that lived, remembered terror, the poem speaks. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. He knows them. Not merely he protects them or he shelters them, though he does those things too. He knows them. He is not indifferent. He is not distant. The one before whom the mountains quake and the rocks shatter, that same one knows by name the frightened ones who have come to hide themselves in him. The scattered exiles of the north, the survivors of the ruined cities of the south, the watchers on the walls of Jerusalem, he knows them. And this is why the comfort cannot be separated from the justice. For a people who have lived under the shadow of the oppressor, comfort is not merely a soft word. It is not merely a promise that things will feel better someday. Comfort, for them, means that the oppressor will not have the last word. It means that the cruelty they have suffered is seen, is counted, is answered. The refuge of God is felt precisely because the storm falls upon the one who terrorized them, and not upon them. The clearing in the storm exists because the storm is real and is aimed rightly. Take away the justice, and the comfort becomes empty. A kind word offered to people whose suffering is never addressed, whose enemies go on forever unchecked. But hold the two together, and the comfort becomes real. The destruction of the oppressor is the necessary clearing that lets the refuge of God be felt. The good news for the victim and the judgment upon the tyrant are not two separate messages. They are one message spoken in one breath. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him, and so the same slowness that we spoke of earlier finds its full meaning here. For if God had been quick, if he had struck at the first offence, at the first cruelty, at the first city broken, then perhaps there would have been more comfort for one moment, but less to trust in over the long years. Instead, the poem shows a God who is patient, and yet who does not forget, a God who waits, and yet who keeps, a God who is slow to anger, and yet who knows by name every one of the suffering who takes shelter in him, and holds them through the long delay, and does not lose a single one. The patience that gave Nineveh its 100 years is the same patience that has kept the memory of every deported family, every fallen city, every terror endured. Nothing has been lost in the waiting. Everything has been held. Rest for a moment in that. The one whose way is in the whirlwind, whose feet raise the clouds like dust, before whom the sea dries up and the mountains melt. That one is good. That one is a refuge. That one knows you. Whatever your own times of trouble have been, and every heart carries some, the poem speaks past the walls of Nineveh and past the centuries to say that there is a shelter, and that the shelter is not indifferent, and that the one who keeps it knows those who come to hide themselves within it. The storm outside does not touch the clearing at its heart. The thunder rolls over the hills, and the rocks are shattered, and the empires fall. And in the midst of it all, a still centre holds, quiet and unafraid, because it belongs to the one before whom all the storms are only dust. Let the breathing slow again. There is nothing to fear in these lines, though they speak of wrath. For the wrath is aimed, and it is aimed rightly, and it is aimed away from the ones who take refuge. The poem has laid its foundation now. It has named the God who stands behind everything that is to come. It has shown him slow, and it has shown him strong, patient beyond measure, and mighty beyond resistance, the two held together as one. It has shown him moving through the world with the storm for a pathway and the clouds for dust. It has shown the sea drying at his rebuke and the mountains melting at his presence. And in the very middle of all that vastness, it has whispered the one word the whole book exists to say. Good. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. The foundation is laid. The frame is set. We know now who is speaking, and we know now the nature of the one on whose behalf the words go out. And only now, having established all of this, the character, the patience, the power, the shelter, will the poem begin, at last, to turn its face toward the city itself. But that turning belongs to the deeper hours of the night, further along in the reading, when the words will move from the God who acts to the fate of the ones he acts against. For now, there is only this to hold. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. Let those lines be the last thing in your mind as the night deepens around you. Not the shattered rocks, not the withered hills, but the still clearing at the centre of the storm and the goodness that keeps it, and the knowing that reaches even to you, here, now, in the quiet. As the poem rests and the breathing slows and the long night settles into its deepest stillness, the foundation has been laid, and there is nothing to do but rest upon it and let the words go on softly in the dark. And so the poem turns. It has stood a long while in the vastness, describing the one who moves through storm and sea and mountain, and now, without warning, it comes down out of the heights and speaks to a single place. The camera of the poem, if we can call it that, has been panning across the whole created order, the drying rivers, the withering hills, the melting stone, and now it stops, it fixes, it looks at one city on one river, and it begins to speak of what will become of it. Listen to the shift. Whatever they plot against the Lord he will bring to an end. Trouble will not come a second time. There it is, the first pivot, the first turning of the face. The words are no longer only about who God is. They are about what God is now doing, and about the ones against whom he is doing it. and the language has grown quiet and certain, the way a verdict is quiet after all the noise of a trial. Whatever they plot against the Lord he will bring to an end. This is the old language of scheming, of counsel taken in dark rooms, of plans laid against a power that cannot be plotted against. There had been a plot. There had been a strategy. There had been an empire that believed it could set its will against the will of heaven and prevail. And the poem answers that belief in a single breath. It will not stand. It will not come to anything. The plan against the Lord is already, in the mind of the prophet, a thing that has failed, not a thing that might fail, but a thing already broken. Though the walls of the city still stand and the army still musters and the machinery of the empire still turns, trouble will not come a second time. There is a promise folded inside that line, addressed not to Nineveh, but to the ones Nineveh has crushed. The affliction that has come once will not come again. The oppressor who returned year after year, campaign after campaign, deportation after deportation, will not return. The wheel that has turned over the necks of so many peoples is about to stop turning. Trouble will not come a second time, because the source of the trouble is about to be removed from the earth, and then the imagery gathers, and it becomes fire and thorns. They will be entangled among thorns and drunk from their wine. They will be consumed like dry stubble. Feel the picture in that. A tangle of thorn bushes, dry and brittle from the long heat, so knotted that a man caught in them cannot free himself, cannot fight, cannot move. And into that tangle comes fire, stubble left in the field after the harvest, the brittle stalks, the useless remnant, the thing already dead and only waiting to be burned. The empire that had seemed like a forest, like a mountain, like a flood, the poem sees it now as dry stubble, as tangled thorns, as kindling waiting for the spark. This is one of the ways the poem does its work. It takes the thing that seemed permanent and shows it to be brittle. It takes the thing that seemed like living power and shows it to be dead wood, only standing until the flame arrives, and the flame is coming. The poem is certain of the flame, and now the address grows sharper still, and a single figure steps out of the crowd of Nineveh and stands alone in the light of the accusation. From you, Nineveh, has one come forth who plots evil against the Lord and devises wicked plans. One has come forth, one counselor, one schemer, one voice out of the city who set his mind against heaven and laid his plans in the dark. The old translations call him a wicked counselor, a counselor of Belial, and that word, Belial, is one of the heaviest words the Hebrew can carry. It means worthlessness. It means baseness. It means a thing that is empty at the core, a counsel that has no substance, a strategy that will come to nothing because it was built on nothing. The man is named not by his own name, but by the emptiness at the heart of him. A worthless counselor, a base schemer, one who devised wickedness and thought himself wise. And here the poem opens a door into history, though it names no name. Who is this one who came forth from Nineveh? The prophet does not tell us directly, and we are left, all these centuries later, to look back into the record and wonder. Some who have studied these lines have set the name of Sennacherib into the space the poem leaves open. Sennacherib, the king who built the palace without rival, the king who swept away 46 of the fortified cities of Judah, the king who stood in the memory of Jerusalem as the very face of the Assyrian threat. He was a man who plotted against the city where the Lord had set his name, who laid siege and demanded surrender, whose armies encircled the walls and whose officials called up to the defenders on the ramparts. If any single figure had come forth from Nineveh devising wicked plans against the Lord, it might well have been the king in his palace, dictating the terms of empire. But others have looked instead at a different figure, a man who stood not in a distant palace but at the very foot of Jerusalem's walls. The Rabshakeh, that was his title, his rank, one of the high officials of the Assyrian court. He was the mouth of the empire, sent to speak its threats aloud where the defenders could hear, and what he did, in the memory of Judah, was worse than threaten. He mocked. He stood beneath the walls and lifted his voice and derided the God of Israel by name, asking whether the God of Jerusalem could deliver the city when no God of any nation had delivered his people from the hand of Assyria. He set the Lord alongside the idols of the conquered and counted him no different, no stronger, no more able to save. He plotted evil against the Lord and devised, in the fullest sense, a wicked plan. The plan of turning a people's trust against itself, of persuading a besieged city that its God was as helpless as the gods of the fallen. We cannot say with certainty which figure the prophet had in mind, or whether he meant a particular man at all, or whether he meant the whole scheming spirit of the empire gathered into a single image. The poem does not say. It leaves the name in shadow and lets the emptiness of the man stand for the emptiness of everything Assyria had built. A worthless counselor, a base schemer, one who came forth from Nineveh and set himself against heaven, and who, for all his plotting, would come to nothing, because that is what worthlessness comes to, nothing. And then the Lord speaks in the first person, and the poem lifts into direct address, and the certainty of it is absolute. This is what the Lord says: "Although they have allies and are numerous, they will be destroyed and pass away. Although I have afflicted you, Judah, I will afflict you no more." Hear the two halves of that. The first is spoken over Nineveh, the second over Judah, and they turn on the same hinge. Although they have allies and are numerous, this is the empire at the height of its strength, the empire with its tributary kings and its vast armies and its allied peoples, the empire that had never lost, that had swept across the known world like the flood the poem has already spoken of, at full strength, many, uncountable in their spears and their chariots and their marching columns, and yet they will be destroyed and pass away. They will be cut down, even at full strength, even at their most numerous, even at the very peak of their power. They will be mown down like a field. It is not that Assyria will grow weak and then fall. It is that Assyria will fall at its strongest, which is the deeper terror and the deeper wonder of the prophecy. For it says that strength is no shield against this. Numbers are no defense. The thing that seemed most secure, most established, most permanent, is the very thing that will pass away. And then the turn to Judah. Although I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. There is no evasion in that first clause. The affliction that Judah suffered is named as affliction, and it is not denied, and it is not minimized. Judah had been afflicted. The 46 cities, the deportations, the siege, the tribute, the fear, all of that had been real, and the poem does not pretend otherwise, but it names an end. I will afflict you no more. The rod that had fallen on the neck of the people would not fall again. And the reason for that end is the fall that has just been declared over Nineveh. The two are one act. The destruction of the oppressor is the liberation of the oppressed. They are not two separate things. They are the same thing, seen from two sides. Now I will break their yoke from your neck and tear your shackles away. The yoke, the wooden bar laid across the neck of the ox to bend it to the plough, the image the ancient world used for subjection, for servitude, for the bending of a whole people to the will of a master. Judah had worn that yoke. It had bent its neck to the tribute and the demands of Assyria for a long grinding stretch of years. And now the poem says the yoke will be broken, not loosened, not lightened, broken, snapped clean and lifted off, so that the neck that had been bent could straighten again, and the shackles that had bound the wrists could be torn away, and the people who'd been slaves could stand upright and walk free. Break their yoke from your neck, tear your shackles away, burst your bonds apart. There is a physical joy in that language, a bodily relief, the relief of a captive whose chains fall from his hands, whose burden is lifted from his shoulders, who feels for the first time in years the lightness of being unbound. This is what the fall of Nineveh means, seen from Judah's side. It means the breaking of a yoke. It means the end of a servitude. It means the sudden, almost unbelievable freedom of a people who had forgotten what it was to walk without a weight upon them. And then, over Nineveh again, a word of finality, spoken by the Lord about the city itself. The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy the images and idols that are in the temple of your gods. I will prepare your grave, for you are vile. You are vile. There is the verdict, plain and unsoftened, and the sentence that follows is total. No descendants to bear the name, the extinction of the line, the end of the memory, the erasure of the future, the images and idols destroyed, the gods of Nineveh cut down in their own temple, the powers the empire had trusted proven powerless to save even themselves. I will prepare your grave, the Lord himself digging the grave of the city, making ready the place where Nineveh will be laid. It is a stunning reversal. The city that had prepared so many graves for so many peoples, the city that had made itself the burying ground of nations, would have its own grave prepared for it. The digger of graves would be laid in a grave. The maker of ruins would be made a ruin. And then, out of all that darkness, comes the brightest single line in the whole book. Look, there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. Let that line breathe. Let it hang in the dark for a moment before we move into it, because it deserves the pause. Look, there, on the mountains. The eye is lifted. It is drawn upward, away from the grave and the vile city and the broken idols, up to the ridgeline of the hills, where something is moving. A figure, a runner, cresting the high ground and coming down toward the city, and the poem does not even wait to hear his words. It sees his feet, the feet of one who brings good news. To understand the force of this, we have to stand where the original hearers stood. We have to be inside a walled city in the ancient world, in a time of war, waiting. There is a watcher on the wall. There is always a watcher on the wall, and his eyes are on the hills, because the hills are where the news will come from. Word travels by foot. A runner is sent from the army or from the border, and he runs, and the distance is great, and the watcher on the wall can do nothing but wait and look. And long before the runner is close enough to shout, long before any word can be heard, the watcher sees him, a shape against the sky, cresting the ridge, coming down the slope. And in that first sighting, before a single syllable is audible, the watcher already knows, because of how the runner runs. A messenger of bad news comes differently, heavy, reluctant, dragging the weight of what he carries. A messenger of good news comes flying, light-footed, urgent with joy, so eager to deliver his word that his whole body speaks it before his mouth can. And the watcher on the wall, seeing the way the feet move across the high ground, knows the war is over, knows the enemy has fallen, knows the siege will be lifted and the fear will end and the ones inside the walls will live. The feet themselves are the message. The sight of them, cresting the ridge, is enough. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of one who brings good news. This is not the only place these words appear. They rise elsewhere in the scriptures of Israel, in the great poetry of comfort spoken to a people in exile, where the same image gleams, the herald on the mountains, the one who proclaims peace, who brings good tidings, who says to a broken people that their God reigns. The Hebrew word for the one who carries this news is a word that means, simply, the bearer of good tidings, the herald whose whole task is to announce the end of trouble and the coming of peace. And Nahum reaches for that same word, that same image, that same shining figure on the high ground, and he sets it here, in the middle of a book that has spoken of wrath and graves and vileness, like a lamp lit in a dark room. Because this is what the whole poem has been building toward on the side of the ones who suffered. Not the destruction for its own sake, not the grave of Nineveh as an end in itself, but this, the runner on the mountains, the herald with the news of peace, the moment when the watchers on the walls of Jerusalem see the feet cresting the ridge and know that the long affliction is over. Celebrate your festivals, Judah, and fulfill your vows. No more will the wicked invade you. They will be completely destroyed. Celebrate your festivals, the feasts that had been held in the shadow of fear, the pilgrimages made under the weight of the yoke, the vows spoken but perhaps unfulfilled in the years of servitude. Now they can be kept freely, joyfully, without the enemy's shadow across them. No more will the wicked invade you. The invader who came season after season will not come again. He is completely destroyed. And so the first movement of the poem closes not on the grave of Nineveh, but on the festivals of Judah, not on the darkness, but on the herald's feet, not on the plotting of the worthless counselor, but on the peace that his plotting could never prevent. This is why the book is more than a book of anger. This is why the prophet's own name means comfort. Because at the very hinge of the prophecy, between the God who moves through the whirlwind and the city whose grave is being dug, there stands a runner on a mountain with good news in his feet, and the whole terrible machinery of judgment is revealed to be, from another angle, the machinery of rescue. The wrath aimed at Nineveh is the peace given to Judah. They are the same act. The breaking of the yoke and the digging of the grave are one motion of the same hand, and then the poem turns again, sharply, and the peace of the herald gives way to the noise of war. But this time the war is at Nineveh's own gates. An attacker advances against you, Nineveh. Guard the fortress, watch the road, brace yourselves, marshal all your strength. Hear the change in the voice. A moment ago it was the light feet of the herald on the mountains. Now it is the tramp of an army, the rush of an assault, the shouted commands of a city trying too late to prepare. And the commands are addressed to Nineveh itself. Guard the fortress, watch the road, brace yourselves, marshal all your strength. And there is something bitter and hard beneath them, because they are commands the poem knows will fail. This is a taunt dressed as advice. The prophet tells Nineveh to do all the things a city does when the enemy's at the gate. Guard the fortress. Post the watch on the road, gird up, gather every soldier, every spear, every ounce of strength the empire can still command. Do all of it. Do everything. And the terrible thing folded inside the command is the certainty that none of it will matter. For the grave has already been prepared. The verdict has already been given. The one who plotted against the Lord has already, in the mind of heaven, come to nothing. And so all this frantic preparation, the guarding, the watching, the marshalling, is the desperate motion of a thing already fallen, still moving out of habit, still going through the forms of defence, when the outcome has already been decided. We can look back now and see the shape of what the prophet foresaw. There came a time when the great powers to the east and south of Assyria turned against it, when the Medes and the Babylonians, long subject or long threatened, joined their strength together against the empire that had ruled so long. Their kings led coalitions that struck at the heart of Assyria. The old religious centre of the empire fell first, sacked some years before the capital itself. And then, in the year the poem seems to foresee, the coalition came against Nineveh, and they laid siege to it, and the siege did not last long by the standards of that age, some months, through the heat of a single stretch of summer. The walls of Nineveh were enormous. They stood tens of feet high, thick enough to run chariots along, ringing the city in a circuit so vast that it had seemed, for generations, simply impossible to breach. No army had taken Nineveh, no power had broken those walls, and for a time, in that final siege, the walls held as they had always held. But there is a detail in the ancient accounts that reaches back and touches a line in the prophecy, and it is one of the strangest and most striking correspondences in the whole book. For the accounts speak of water, of heavy seasonal rains, of the river swelling, of the flood loosening and breaking down a portion of the defences that no ram and no ladder had been able to overcome. The very river the city was built beside, the river that had made it great, the river that had carried its trade and filled its aqueducts and watered its gardens. That river rose against it, and where the water broke the wall, the coalition poured in. And the prophet, generations before, had written a line that seems to see it coming from far off, though he could not have known the summer or the year or the height of the flood. But that line, and the flashing chariots, and the scarlet shields, and the soldiers stumbling in their haste, and the throwing open of the river gates, all of that belongs to the deeper reaches of the night, further along in the reading, when the assault the prophet foretold will be traced in its full and terrible detail. For now it is enough to hold the shape of the turning. The poem has come down out of the vastness and fixed its eye on the city. It has named the worthless counsellor and declared his plotting empty. It has promised Judah that its yoke will break and its shackles fall away. It has lifted the eyes to the mountains and shown, against all the darkness, the light feet of the herald with his news of peace. And it has begun, at the very end, to describe the attacker advancing on Nineveh's own gates, the frantic and futile call to man the walls, the certainty of a verdict already given. Let the mind rest again on the brightest of it. Not the grave that is being prepared, but the feet on the mountains. Not the shackles, but the tearing of them away. Not the worthless counsel of the schemer in his palace, but the certainty that his scheming came to nothing, that trouble will not come a second time, that the ones who took shelter were held through all of it, and were not lost. Look, there, on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. Let that be the image you carry down into the deeper dark. A runner cresting a ridge, light-footed with joy, coming down the slope toward a waiting city, and the mere sight of him enough to say that the long fear is over and the peace has come. Let the breathing slow around that picture. Let the night settle, and let the poem go on softly in the dark, toward the assault that waits in the hours ahead. And so the poem goes on, and the picture it paints grows stranger and older still. For after the assault, and after the chariots, and after the scarlet of the shields, the prophet reaches for an image that would have made every listener in that age lean forward. He reaches for the lion. There is a question in the middle of the second chapter, and it is a taunt, and it is meant to be heard as a taunt. Where now is the lion's den, the place where they fed their young, where the lion and lioness went, and the cubs with nothing to fear? You have to understand what the lion meant to Nineveh to understand the sting of the question. The lion was not, for Assyria, merely a beast of the wilds. The lion was the empire's own face in the mirror. It was the sign a king pressed onto himself, the emblem he wanted the world to see when it looked toward his throne. The lion stood for strength that took what it wanted, for ferocity that answered to no one, for dominion held not by argument, but by teeth. And the kings of Assyria did not leave this to metaphor alone. They carved it into stone. On the walls of the great palaces of Nineveh there were reliefs, panel after panel of them, and among the most famous were the scenes of the lion hunt. There is one in particular, from the North Palace, the palace of the king Ashurbanipal, who reigned from around 668 to around 631 before the Common Era. The lion hunt of Ashurbanipal it is called now, and it is one of the great works of the ancient world, carved with a precision that still catches the breath of anyone who stands before it. In those panels the king rides in his chariot, or stands with his bow drawn to the ear, and around him the lions come. They spring, and they fall. They are shown wounded, arrows driven into their flanks, blood carved into the stone, their great bodies twisting as they die. There is a lioness, famous now, dragging her hindquarters, her spine severed by an arrow, her forelegs still hauling her forward in defiance while death takes the rest of her. The carver saw her pain, and cut it into the rock so that it could not be forgotten, and the king stands over all of it, unhurt, magnificent, pouring out an offering, master of the field. Now we might look at those scenes and see only cruelty, or only sport, and there is cruelty in them, and there is a kind of terrible sport. But that is not how the men who made them understood the act. For them the lion hunt was not a diversion. It was ritual, and it was theology, and it was propaganda all at once. The wilderness in the Assyrian mind was chaos. It was the untamed world, the place of danger and disorder that pressed always against the edges of the ordered land. And the lion was chaos made flesh. So when the king went out and hunted the lions and killed them, he was not merely showing off his skill with a bow. He was performing his highest duty. He was standing between his people and the chaos of the world and beating it back with his own hands. He was saying to his subjects and to his gods that so long as he reigned, the disorder of the wild would not swallow the good order of the land. The lion hunt was the king proving that he was fit to rule, that he could protect, that he could subdue the wilderness and keep the peace inside the walls, and so the lion belonged to the throne twice over. It was the king's emblem, the sign of his own ferocity, and it was the king's prey, the thing he mastered to prove his right to rule. He was the lion, and he was the hunter of lions, and both meanings served his glory. Hold all of that in mind, and now hear what the prophet does with it. He takes the emblem, the very sign of the throne, the boast carved into the palace walls, and he turns it back against the city like a blade reversed. He describes the lions in their den. The lion, he says, killed enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his mate. He filled his lairs with the kill and his dens with the mangled prey. Read that slowly, and you will hear what it is. It is a picture of a hunter who never stops hunting. A predator who kills far beyond his need, who tears and strangles and drags the carcasses home, who piles his lair full of the dead until the very floor of the den is a slaughterhouse. This is not the noble lion of the hunt panels. This is the lion accused. This is the empire seen not as the guardian against chaos, but as the source of it. The one who fills his dens with the mangled bodies of the prey he did not need to take. And that, the prophet is saying, is Nineveh. Not the protector, the predator, not the one who beats back the disorder of the world, but the one who carried disorder into every land it touched, who tore and strangled and hauled the spoils home to fill its lairs, generation after generation, until the palaces overflowed and the storerooms were packed with the wealth of nations that had done nothing to deserve their ruin. The king had carved himself as the lion to say, I am strong, I protect, I am fit to rule. The prophet takes the same lion and says, yes, you are the lion, and here is what your kind of strength has always meant. Blood on the floor of the den, the mangled prey of 100 peoples heaped in your storerooms, a hunger that was never fed enough, that killed past all need, that mistook slaughter for greatness. And then comes the question, and now you can feel its full weight. Where is the lion's den now? Where is the place where they fed their young? Where the lion and the lioness walked, and the cubs with nothing in all the world to fear? The question is asked of an empty ruin. It is asked of a den that has been found and plundered and left bare. It is asked as a man might stand in the wreckage of a great house and say softly, so where are they now, the ones who lived here, the ones nobody could touch? And there is no answer, because there is no one left to answer. The lion who tore prey for his cubs are gone. The lair that was heaped with the kill, it is emptied, and what it held is scattered, and the wealth of nations that was piled inside it belongs now to others, to the very kind of hunters the empire once was, who came and took the den for their own. The voice of the lion is silenced, for the prophet does not leave the question hanging without a verdict. He gives the verdict in the voice of God himself. I am against you, he says. I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave you no prey on the earth. The voices of your messengers will no longer be heard. Every clause is a stripping away. The chariots that carried the terror of Assyria across the world, burned up into smoke, gone. The young lions, the next generation of hunters, the cubs who were to inherit the killing, the sword devours them. The prey, the endless supply of nations to tear and strangle and haul home, cut off from the earth so that there is nothing left to hunt, and the messengers. Think of what the messengers of Nineveh had been. The officials who came to the gates of besieged cities and spoke the terms, the heralds who carried the demands of the great king across the mountains, whose very arrival made kings tremble, whose voices announced the coming of the army and the coming of the end. Those voices, the prophet says, will no longer be heard. The empire that spoke and the world obeyed will fall silent, and so the emblem is dismantled with its own symbolism, and this is the emotional height of the second chapter, the moment when imperial pride, carved so carefully into the palace walls, is taken apart using the very image the empire chose for itself. The lion is not slain by some greater beast. The lion is simply found in the end to be gone. The den is empty, the voice is silent, and the one who filled his lairs with the mangled prey of the world has become himself, the thing that is torn away and scattered. Let the mind rest a moment on the strangeness of that. A city so sure of its strength that it wrote its strength onto its walls in stone, and a poet who took that stone-carved certainty and turned it, gently and completely, into a picture of ruin. Now the poem gathers itself, and it opens the third and final chapter, and it opens it with a single terrible word: woe. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. Hear how the phrases fall one after another like blows. City of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. There is no gentleness in the opening of this chapter, and the reading will not pretend there is. But we can read even the hardest lines slowly, and let them lie in the quiet, and understand what the prophet is naming. He is naming the crimes. Up to now the poem has spoken of God's power, and of the schemers plotting, and of the assault at the gates, and of the empty den. Now, at last, it says plainly why. City of blood. The words are not poetry only, they rest on a history. The empire that ruled from Nineveh, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, endured for centuries, and across those centuries it built its power on a method, and the method was terror. One of its chief instruments was deportation. When a people rebelled, or when a land was conquered, the Assyrian state did not simply install a governor and move on. It pulled the people up by the roots, it marched them, whole populations of them, across the empire to distant provinces, and it brought other uprooted peoples in to replace them. The purpose was cold and deliberate. Break the bonds of place and memory. Scatter a nation so that it can no longer remember what it was, cannot gather its old loyalties, cannot rise again around a shared identity, because the shared identity has been broken across 1,000 miles of forced march. By the 7th century before the Common Era, Nineveh itself was full of the results of this policy. Elites and craftsmen and labourers dragged from every corner of the conquered world to serve the capital. The city's very population was, in part, a monument to the uprooting of others, and alongside the deportations came the atrocities, and here the ancient records are not silent, for the Assyrian kings themselves recorded what they did, and they recorded it with pride. Kings like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal set down accounts of their campaigns on the walls of their palaces and on inscriptions meant to last forever, and in those accounts they boasted of cruelties that are difficult to speak aloud. The flaying of captives, the display of severed heads, the making of examples so ghastly that word of them would run ahead of the army and break the will of the next city before the army even arrived. This was not the excess of soldiers out of control. This was policy. This was calculated. The terror was a tool, wielded on purpose, to warn every people who might think of rebellion what rebellion would cost. And the empire wrapped this in a story about itself. In the Assyrian telling, the state was righteous, and the enemies were wicked, and the cruelty was justice, the punishment of the wicked by the righteous power that the gods had raised up to rule. The severed heads and the flayed captives were, in this telling, the just deserts of those who defied the ordered world. It was the same theology as the lion hunt, the king subduing the chaos, the state punishing the wicked, the terror renamed as justice, and this is precisely what the prophet exposes. He looks at the empire's account of itself, the righteous state, the just punishment, the noble subduing of chaos, and he tears the label off. City of blood, he says, full of lies. The lies are not only the falsehood spoken to enemies, the lie is the whole self-portrait, the empire's story that its violence was justice, that its terror was order, that its plunder was the right of the strong and the will of the gods. The prophet names it what it is, not justice, bloodshed, not order, plunder, not the punishment of the wicked, a city never for a single day without its victims. And then the poem does something remarkable, something that the reading will now slow to let you feel. It stops explaining, and it lets you hear the thing itself. For in the next lines, the prophet does not tell you about the Assyrian war machine. He puts you inside it. The crack of the whip, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses, jolting chariots. In the original tongue, these lines come in short, hammering bursts, sound piled on sound, the words themselves clattering like the thing they describe, so that even a listener who did not understand the meaning would feel the pounding of it in the rhythm alone. It is almost like a scene set to sound. The whip cracks, the wheels clatter, the horses gallop, the chariots jolt, and then the images come faster and darker, charging cavalry, flashing swords, glittering spears, piles of dead, heaps of corpses, bodies without number. People stumbling over the bodies. This is the war machine of Assyria, rendered not as a record but as an experience. The noise and the speed and the pile of the dead all thrown at you at once, the way it would have come at the peoples who stood in its path. And the terrible turn of it, the thing the prophet means you to understand, is that this scene of galloping horses and flashing swords and bodies beyond counting is now Nineveh's own. The city that made this scene in 100 lands is going to stand at last inside it. The whip that cracked over the backs of the deported now cracks in the streets of the deporter. The wheels that clattered into 100 conquered gates now clatter through the gates of the capital. The bodies without number that Assyrian scribes once tallied with pride on palace walls now lie in the avenues of Nineveh, and the survivors stumble over their own dead. The city that inflicted the scene will suffer the scene. That is the whole argument of the chapter, and it is delivered not as a sermon but as a thing you can hear and see, the war noise of the empire turned at last upon the empire. And to make the argument certain, to leave no room for the objection that Nineveh was too great and too strong to fall like other cities, the prophet reaches for a name. He reaches for Thebes. Noamun, he calls it, the city of Amun, the great city of Upper Egypt, capital of the Egyptian Empire, the seat of the god Amun, one of the mightiest and most storied cities of the ancient world. Are you better than Thebes? He asks Nineveh. Are you better than Noamon? And the question has an edge to it that only history can sharpen. For everyone who heard the prophet knew what had happened to Thebes. They knew because it had happened in their own lifetimes, or within the memory of their fathers. Thebes had fallen to the Assyrians themselves, to Ashurbanipal, the very king who carved the lion hunt onto his palace walls, in the year 663 before the Common Era. Less than 50 years, perhaps, before Nahum spoke. Nineveh had done this thing. Nineveh had sacked Thebes. And now the prophet turns and holds Thebes up to Nineveh's face like a mirror. Consider Thebes, he says. Consider what she was. She sat by the Nile with the waters all around her. The river was her defence, the prophet says, and the waters her wall. Thebes was thought to be impregnable, ringed by the Nile and its network of canals, so that any attacker would have to cross water to reach her. A rampart of river, a wall made of the flood. And she had strength beyond her waters. Cush was her strength, the prophet says, Ethiopia, the land to her south, and Egypt too, and there was no end to it. Put and Libya were among her allies, among the soldiers who fought for her. She had the great river as her moat and whole nations as her friends and her fighting men. By every measure a city could be measured, she was safe, she was strong, she was old and rich and defended and allied, and it seemed that nothing could ever bring her down. And yet she was taken, yet she went into exile, yet she was carried away captive. The prophet does not soften what came next, and the reading will speak it plainly, though gently, and let it settle in the dark. Her infants were dashed to pieces at every street corner. Lots were cast for her nobles, and all her great men were bound in chains. This is the record. This is what the conqueror did to Thebes. The children killed in the streets, the nobles divided up by the drawing of the lots, as men divide plunder. The great men, the councillors and the lords, dragged away in chains to serve as slaves in a distant land. And the one who did it, the one who cast down Thebes for all her waters and all her allies, was Assyria. Ashurbanipal's own records boast of the spoils he carried away from the fallen city: gold and silver, precious stones, and 2 great obelisks hauled off from the temples as trophies of the sack. The Assyrian king counted his plunder proudly, the wealth of the greatest city of Egypt carried home to feed the lion's den. And now the prophet takes that same conqueror and that same boast and turns it into a warning that cannot be answered. Are you better than Thebes? Thebes had the Nile for a wall, and you have the Tigris. Thebes had nations for allies, and where are your allies now? Thebes was thought impregnable, and so are you. And Thebes fell, and her children were killed in the streets, and her nobles were dragged away in chains, and you are the one who did it. You know exactly what it looks like when a great city falls, because you made it look that way. You held the whip, you cast the lots, you carried off the obelisks. You have already shown the world with your own hands that no wall of water and no crowd of allies can save a city when its hour has come. And now, the prophet says, the same thing you did to Thebes will be done to you. This is the most pointed historical argument in the whole book. It is not a threat pulled from the air. It is Nineveh's own recent deed held up as its own coming sentence. The prophet is saying, in effect, you have already written the ending of your own story. You wrote it on the streets of Thebes. You wrote it in the blood of her children and the chains of her nobles and the spoils you dragged home in triumph. And what you wrote there, you will now read here. No city is immune to the justice it has dealt to others. The stronger the wall, the harder the fall, and Nineveh's wall was strong indeed, and Nineveh had proven, with her own campaign, that the strongest wall was not enough. There is, buried in this, a truth that runs under the whole book and rises here to the surface. The empire believed that strength was its own justification, that because it could tear, it had the right to tear, that because no one could stop it, no one would ever call it to account. And the prophet answers that belief with a single unanswerable fact from the empire's own record. Thebes was strong, and Thebes could not stop you. You are strong, and your strength will not stop the one who now comes against you. The wheel turns. The lion who filled his den with the prey of nations becomes, in his turn, the prey. The hunter who dashed the children of Thebes in her streets will hear the same cry rise in his own. The one who cast lots for the nobles of Egypt will be counted himself among the divided spoil, and all of it, the deportations, the flayed captives, the severed heads, the terror renamed as justice, the lie that strength is the same as right, all of it comes back around, and the city of blood drinks at last from its own cup. But hold even here to the shape of the comfort that the prophet buried at the beginning, and that has never left the poem however dark it grows. This is not chaos answering chaos. This is not merely one empire eating another, the endless turning of the wheel with no meaning at its centre. For the God the prophet named at the very start is slow to anger, and good, and a refuge in the day of trouble, and he knows those who take shelter in him. The undoing of Nineveh is not the world's cruelty simply cycling on. It is the world's cruelty at last meeting its limit. It is the victims of Thebes, and the deported of 100 nations, and the strangled prey heaped in the lion's den, being at last remembered by a justice that is not deaf, and not asleep, and not for sale. The city of blood is called to account not by a greater predator, but by the one who cares that blood was shed. And that is a hard comfort, but it is a comfort, that there is a reckoning, that the strong do not in the end escape merely because they are strong, that the mangled prey of the world is not forgotten, even when the empire that mangled it has carved itself in stone as the guardian of order and the punisher of the wicked. There is one who sees past the carving to the blood on the floor of the den. Let the mind rest there in the deepening quiet, not on the streets of Thebes, nor on the piled dead in the avenues of Nineveh, nor on the crack of the whip and the clatter of the wheels. Let those images loosen and drift and grow far off, as things heard about a war very long ago and very far away. Rest instead on the truth beneath them, that the den will be found empty because the tearing is over, that the whip will fall silent because the terror has met its end, that the God who is slow to anger is also in the fullness of time sure, and that the ones who took shelter in him, the small nations, the uprooted, the children of 100 deported peoples, the watchers on the wall who longed for the feet of the herald on the mountains, those ones are known to him and held by him and not lost. Let the breathing slow, let the war noise fade into the dark, and let the poem go on softly toward the last of its images in the hours that still lie ahead. And so the poem goes on softly into its last movement, where the noise of the assault gives way to something stranger and quieter, the sight of a great strength that simply comes apart in the hands that held it. For the prophet now turns to the walls themselves, to the fortresses that Nineveh trusted, the towers and the gates and the strongholds that had made the city feel untouchable for so long, and he does not describe them falling under the ram. He does not describe them breached by the flood or scaled by the ladder. He reaches instead for something gentler, and for that very reason more devastating. Listen to the words. All your fortresses are like fig trees with their first ripe fruit. When they are shaken, the figs fall into the mouth of the eater. Consider the picture the prophet has chosen. A fig tree in the early summer, heavy with its first ripe fruit. The figs at the top of the season, the ones that come first, are the softest, the sweetest, the readiest to fall. You do not need to climb the tree to have them. You do not need a ladder, or a knife, or a basket, or any labour at all. You have only to take the trunk in your hands and shake it once, and the ripe figs let go of the branch and drop. They fall of their own weight, and they fall, the prophet says, straight into the mouth of the one who waits beneath the tree. This is the image he sets against the walls of the mightiest city in the world. Not a wall broken, a fig shaken loose. The greatest fortifications of the ancient earth, the circuit that ran for miles, the towers that shadowed the plain, the gates that had swallowed the tribute of nations, reduced in a single line to fruit so ripe it cannot hold to the branch. The slightest touch, and it drops. The lightest shaking, and it is in the eater's mouth. There is no struggle in the image. There is no long defence, no heroic last stand at the ramparts, no clash of arms upon the wall that goes on for days. There is only the ease of it, the horrible, effortless ease of a strength that has become ripe for falling. And the mind, drifting, may find its own quiet in that, for it turns out that the thing which looked immovable was only waiting for its season. The wall that had stood for generations, that had seemed as fixed as the hills, was all along a fig on the branch, holding on by less than anyone thought. And when the season came, It did not need to be conquered. It needed only to be shaken. Then the prophet looks past the walls to the men who were meant to hold them, and here too the strength dissolves before the eye. He speaks to the soldiers, to the warriors of Assyria, the men whose fathers had made the nations tremble, and he tells them what they will become in the day of trouble. Look at your troops, he says, and the word he uses cuts, for these are the men of a war machine that had terrorized the known world. They are all weaklings. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies. Fire has consumed the bars of your gates. The gates thrown open, the bars burned through. The very hinges of the city's safety gone soft in the flame, and the men who should have stood in the breach, the prophet does not even grant them the dignity of dying in battle. He says they have become like women in the terror of the moment, the ancient image of panic, of hands gone weak, of knees turned to water. The teeth of the empire have simply lost their bite. The hand that gripped the whip cannot close, and so the prophet calls out to the doomed city, half in mockery and half in a strange, weary practicality, telling it to prepare for the siege that is already lost. Draw water for the siege, he says. Strengthen your defences, work the clay, tread the mortar, repair the brickwork, go down into the pit and mix the mud, take hold of the brick mould and make the walls thick. It is the language of a city bracing for the worst, hauling water against the long thirst of the siege, patching the walls where the years have worn them, laying up brick against the day the ram comes to the gate. And it is spoken over a city for whom none of it will matter. Repair the wall, or the fire will still find the bar of the gate. Draw the water, the flood will still come through the river gates. Mix the mortar, the fig is already ripe, and the hand is already on the trunk. There is a terrible tenderness, almost, in the way the prophet lets the city labour. Let them work, the poem seems to say. Let them draw the water and mix the clay and thicken the wall. It changes nothing. The season has come. And then, having stripped the walls and the warriors and the works, the prophet reaches for the last and greatest of these images, the one this whole final movement has been building toward. He turns to the merchants and the officials, to the officers and the guards, to all the swarming multitude of people who fill the streets of the greatest city in the world, and he compares them to locusts. Now, this must be heard rightly, for it is not a small comparison, and it is not an accident. The locust, to the ancient world, was one of the most feared things that could come. A swarm of locusts was not an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. It came out of the horizon like a moving cloud, darkening the sun as it approached, and it settled on a land, and it ate. It ate the standing grain and the vine and the fig and the leaf on the tree, and it left the country stripped bare from horizon to horizon, as though fire had passed over it. A locust plague could bring famine to a whole region. It could empty granaries and hollow out kingdoms, and it moved with a will that was not one will but a million, a devouring multitude that could not be reasoned with and could not be turned back and could not be counted. That is the image the prophet has been holding in reserve, because Assyria had been exactly that to the nations. Assyria had come out of the horizon like a moving cloud. Assyria had settled on the lands of 100 peoples and stripped them bare. The grain, the tribute, the treasure, the people themselves, carried off, deported, resettled, until whole countries were left hollow and quiet. Assyria had been the locust of the world, uncountable in its armies, insatiable in its appetite, moving across the earth and leaving stripped ground behind it. And so when the prophet says of Nineveh's own multitudes that they are like locusts, he is turning the empire's whole nature back upon it, the way he turned the lion and the way he turned Thebes. You were the swarm, he is saying, now become the swarm's own ending. You have increased the number of your merchants, he says, till they are more numerous than the stars in the sky. More than the stars, count them if you can. The merchants of Nineveh crowding the markets, the wealth of the world flowing through the city's hands, buyers and sellers beyond number filling the streets of the capital of the earth, and then the reversal. But like locusts, they strip the land and then fly away. There it is. They stripped the land and then they flew away. The very act that made them fearsome, the stripping, the devouring, the swarming, is the same act that ends in their vanishing. For that is the thing about a swarm. It comes and it consumes, and then, in a single hour, it lifts and it is gone. And where it settled, there is only the stripped and silent ground, and no swarm at all, and no way to say where the swarm has gone. Then comes the line that is the very heart of this final movement, the image that the documentary has been moving toward through all these hours, the picture in which the empire does not die so much as it evaporates. Your guards are like locusts, your officials like swarms of locusts that settle in the walls on a cold day. But when the sun appears, they fly away, and no one knows where. Hold that line in the quiet. Let it settle the way the poem asks the swarm to settle. Picture the locusts on a cold morning. When the air is cold, the locust cannot fly. Its body needs warmth to move. And so on a cold day, the swarm settles into the crevices of a wall, packing itself into the cracks and the joints of the stone, clustering there in the chill, thick upon the wall, covering it, a living crust upon the masonry. If you came upon the wall in that cold hour, you would think the swarm was part of it, fixed there, settled, immense, a thing that would not move. You would count the wall itself lost beneath them, and then the sun rises, the cold burns off, the stone warms, and the air warms, and the locusts feel the heat, and they open their wings, and in an hour, perhaps in minutes, the whole vast swarm that seemed a permanent thing lifts off the wall and rises into the morning and is gone. The wall stands bare. The cracks that were packed with a living multitude are empty. The stone is warm and silent under the sun, and no one, the prophet is exact and pitiless and unforgettable in this, no one knows where they went, not driven off in a battle you could describe, not slain in a heap you could number, not marched away in chains you could follow, simply gone. The swarm that darkened the sky and stripped the earth lifted in the warmth of a single morning and vanished and left no trace of where. This is how the prophet chooses to show the fall of the greatest empire the world had yet seen. Not, in the end, with the crash of the wall and the clatter of the wheels, though those things happened. Not with the pile dead in the avenues, though those things happened too, but with this, the stillness of a warm stone where a swarm had been. The empire does not go down fighting in the last of the poem's images. The empire evaporates. The officials, the guards, the merchants, numberless as stars, the whole swarming machinery of a superpower, packed into the walls of the world on the cold day of their strength, and then, when the season turned, simply lifted and simply gone, and no one able to say where. And here the history closes over the poetry like water over a stone. For the city fell in the year 612 before the Common Era, after a siege of some 3 months, to the coalition the prophet never named, the Medes and the Babylonians, and with them, the accounts say, the Scythians from the north. The greatest city in the world, the city that had been the largest on the earth, the city on the eastern bank of the Tigris where the river ran past its wall, was taken and sacked and burned and unmade, not merely conquered, deurbanized, emptied of its life so thoroughly that the swarm indeed could not be found, and the last of the prophet's words are spoken to no one and to everyone, to the king of Assyria himself, in the moment his empire lifts off the wall of the world. Your shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria, your nobles lie down to rest. The shepherds, the leaders, the ones who were meant to guard the flock, asleep. The nobles, the great men of the greatest court on earth, lying down to rest, and it is the rest from which there is no rising. Your people are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. There is the swarm again, only now it is not locusts on a warm morning. It is the people of Assyria themselves, scattered on the mountains, thrown across the high country, and, the phrase is the whole grief of it, with no one to gather them, no shepherd to call them in, no king to fold them home. The gatherer of the nations, the empire that had gathered 100 peoples into its deportations and its resettlements and its lists, is itself scattered now, and there is no one left who gathers. And then the final verse of the book, and there is no softer landing than this, for the prophet gives none. Nothing can heal your wound, your injury is fatal, an incurable wound, not a wound that will hurt for a season and then close, not an injury the empire will limp away from and rebuild, a fatal wound, the kind from which no recovery comes, ever, from which no bandage and no physician, and no passing of years will bring healing. And this, the readers of the prophets have long said, is among the most unsparing endings in all of prophetic literature. There is no turn at the last moment toward mercy. There is no crack of light let into the dark for Nineveh's sake. The wound is fatal, and the book says so, and the book does not take it back. Everyone who hears the news about you claps his hands at your fall. Everyone, all who hear. For the terror had touched everyone, and so the news of its ending touches everyone, and the whole earth that had trembled under the swarm now claps its hands in the strange, exhausted relief of the ones who feared it and lived. The clap of hands at the fall of Nineveh is the sound of 100 nations exhaling at once, and the poem ends there, on that clap of hands, and does not say another word. Now consider what became of the wound that could not heal. For the prophet's word was not the end of it. The centuries that followed made his poem into stone, or rather, into the absence of stone. The city that had been the largest in the world was so thoroughly unmade that it slipped, within a few generations, out of the memory of the very land it had ruled. By the time a Greek soldier named Xenophon marched through that country with his 10,000, some 2 centuries after the fall, writing the account men would come to call the Anabasis, the ruins by the Tigris had already become a mystery to those who lived beside them. The people of the region no longer knew, with any certainty, what the great mounds had been. The name of Nineveh had loosened from the place. The superpower had become a rumour, and then less than a rumour, an unmarked swelling of the ground where the largest city on earth had stood. And so there grew up in later ages that resonant anecdote, told and retold whether or not every detail can be pinned down, that when Alexander the Great and his armies passed near the site, they marched by without knowing that a world capital had ever stood there at all. Whether the tale is exact in its particulars, the historians will debate, but what it illustrates is simply true. The city that carved itself into the walls of its palaces as the everlasting master of the earth had vanished so completely from the consciousness of the world that mighty armies could walk past its grave and never know a grave was there. The swarm had lifted, and no one knew where it went. The stone was warm and silent under the sun, and where a superpower once stood, there was only the quiet of the desert, and the wind moving over the low mounds, and the river going on past the place as it had gone on before the city, and as it would go on after. That is the wound that did not heal. And now, having followed the poem all the way to its unsparing end, and having watched history close over it, let the whole thing quiet, and come back, in the last of these hours, to where it began. For there is something to notice about this book now that its last verse has fallen silent. In 3 chapters of prophecy against Nineveh, there is no call to repentance. There is no altar built and no invitation offered. There is no word to the city that says, "Turn and be spared." Nowhere in the poem does the prophet stand at the gate as another prophet once did, and cry out that in 40 days the city may yet be saved if only it will bow. That door had already opened once, 100 years before. That door had already been walked through and then walked back out of and slammed. Nahum's book is not written to change Nineveh's mind. Nineveh's mind is not the subject of it. The book is written, from its first line to its last, for the other people, for the ones who had suffered under the swarm, for the small nations that had been stripped like a field of grain, For the uprooted and the deported the peoples carried off from their own hills and set down in strange country with no one to gather them. For Judah, watching the machine of the world roll toward Jerusalem, wondering whether anything at all stood between them and the same fate that had swallowed Samaria and Lachish, and 46 fortified towns. For the watchers on the wall who longed for the herald's feet upon the mountains. The whole book, all its dark and driving poetry, all its chariots and lions and ripe figs and vanishing swarms, is a single message delivered to the ones who were crushed. And the message is this: what you endured was seen. What you endured will be answered. You were not forgotten in your suffering, and the strength that broke you will not in the end escape merely because it was strong. That is the whole of it. And so, at the last, let the mind travel back past all the noise, past the fatal wound and the clapping hands, past the scattered people on the mountains and the empty walls where the swarm had settled, past the burning gates and the flood at the river and the herald on the height, all the way back to the 7th verse of the 1st chapter, where the prophet, before he had said a single word about Nineveh's crimes or Nineveh's fall, had already told us the thing that would outlast the empire. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows those who trust in him. Everything else in the book is thunder. This alone is the quiet at the centre of the thunder. The Lord is good, not merely powerful, though he is that. Good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, a place to stand when the swarm is on the horizon and the wall will not hold, and he knows those who trust in him. Knows them, not knows about them, the way a king knows the size of the empire he has conquered. Knows them the way one is known who is held, who is sheltered, who is remembered by name in the day when everyone else forgets. The God who is slow to anger and great in power. The God whose slowness Nineveh once mistook for weakness and license. That same God the prophet says at the beginning and never unsays, is the one in whose shadow the vulnerable are hidden. The two are not different gods. The God of the fatal wound and the God of the stronghold are one. The justice that came down upon the city of blood and the tenderness that gathers the scattered are the same tenderness, the same justice, seen from the two sides of a single truth. Because he is good, the swarm did not devour forever. Because he knows those who trust in him, the mangled prey of the world was not, in the end, left mangled and forgotten in the den. Because he is a stronghold in the day of trouble, the day of trouble was not the last word. And so the poem that began in a whirlwind ends, for the one who listens, in a stillness. The empires rise and the empires carve their strength into stone, and the empires march across the nations like locusts and darken the sun. And the empires fall, and their walls go warm and empty, and their names loosen from the ground, and armies march past their graves and never know. But the goodness that the prophet named at the beginning does not fall, and does not vanish, and cannot be shaken from the branch. It is a stronghold still, in the day of trouble, whatever the day of trouble may be. And the ones who take shelter in it are known. Let that be the last thing carried down into sleep. Not the crack of the whip, and not the piled dead in the avenues, and not the clatter of the wheels. Let all of that be very long ago now, and very far away, a war heard about in the quiet, growing fainter with every breath. Let the stone go warm and silent under the sun. Let the wind move over the low mounds where a superpower once stood and pass on, and rest instead in the small and steady word that outlasted the great and terrible one, that the Lord is good, that he is a stronghold in the day of trouble, and that he knows those who trust in him. Rest there, breathe slow, the reckoning is sure, and it is not yours to carry. The swarm has lifted, and the tearing is over, and the den is empty at last. You are seen, you are known. And in the shadow of the one who is slow to anger and great in power, you are hidden and held and not lost. Let the breathing slow, let the last of the war noise fade into the dark, and sleep.